Welcome to the Thrive Today podcast. I'm Natalie Bourne. I'm the media host for Thrive Today and the founder of Innovation Meets Leadership. This podcast is designed for women who lead and believe. And today we are sitting down with our founder, Colleen Rouse. Not only is she the founder of Thrive Today, but she's also the founding pastor and senior pastor of Victory Church in Atlanta, Georgia. She led alongside her husband for over 30 years. And now she is the founding pastor there. And so we are just thrilled because we are going to talk about a topic today that I think you are going to lean into in a big, big way. Welcome to the podcast, Colleen.
Thank you. It's always good to sit down together, Natalie. I love what comes out of our conversation.
I do too. Well, I'm excited about this one because we are going to talk a little bit about your interview with John Maxwell. And you're just going to tell us a little bit about what led you to sit down with him and a little bit about what you covered. But then we're going to really dig into some just gems, some nuggets that the both of you had in a conversation recently.
That sounds like a plan. You know, the thing is, it's definitely appropriate that I sit down with John Maxwell because Thrive would not exist had it not been with his generosity to give me Thrive. The original form of Thrive was really just always directed to women. It was more of a general women's ministry, and he had events, and he would bring in the who's who to just kind of, hit us with the best. And so it was always excellent. And at the same time, I felt led to start this initiative that is really focused on women in leadership in those roles with corporate America, as entrepreneurs, as pastors, ministers, because who is talking to the women leaders? And so this is developing in me, and some conversations that I had with John, just kind of passing this idea onto him. After all, he's one of the most important mentors in my life for over 20 years. And not only did he love it, he ended up giving me Thrive. So it was time for us to sit down and talk about leadership together. And I'm so thrilled to have John Maxwell on the cover. He's the first and maybe the only male who ever appeared on the cover of Thrive Today.
Well, and when everyone sees this cover, it's so beautiful. The colors are beautiful, and just the relationship that you guys have cultivated, along with your spouses, who there's a picture of them in this particular article as well. Just the relationship cultivated over many years, and that mentorship relationship is so powerful. Part of what you anchor on is this idea of an intentional life or intentional living. And to me, this just becomes the backbone of something that we can think about for our leadership.
Absolutely. And John has written a book around intentional living. And there's two things that I want to highlight about that, because I see a younger generation coming up, and I don't know that they fully have a grasp on what it means to live with this intentionality. There's evidence to the fact, if you do believe that, there's a way that you go about your life. And, are you spending hours and hours on this device playing games, that are giving you a false sense of accomplishment? That's not intentional living. It's haphazard. And so naturally, the yield of that is going to be frustration, and you aren't going to accomplish the maximum of what you've been sent here to do. So the other side of intentional living is the D types. And I would fall into that category. Those who are like, have a gusto for life and just are going after it. And intentionality has to be not just be connected to, I'm going to grit this out, I'm not going to give up. Because if what you're pursuing is not connected to your purpose, then it truly isn't intentional living. Intentionality has to be around what God intended for us to do and be while we're here. So that's something that we've got to narrow down the focus on in order to live truly intentionally.
Wow, you said so much right there. I mean, when I think about the idea of your purpose being connected to what you're doing, the two of you talked about this idea of drive versus dedication. And I want to unpack that a little bit, because I felt like the both of you had a really interesting conversation around this that I think can help us when we think about the difference between being driven and dedicated.
And, I had to learn this personally. So I want to quote one of the comments that he made during the interview, he said, a driven person doesn't listen. A driven person doesn't learn. They just drive.
Mm.
I think you could be 100% dedicated to something and still listen, make adjustments, and make changes in your life.
Wow.
So he really highlights one of the distinctions between being driven and being dedicated. And I just want to step back behind the scenes on that as far as the way we function and what our understanding is, because there's a difference to me between lighting a fire within and lighting a fire underneath. And this is important for us to understand in trying to lead our team. You know, are you coming in the room? How are you showing up? Are you coming in the room and lighting a fire underneath? Because what you are saying to them is either going to light the fire within or light the fire underneath. The underneath fire is where you talk about deadlines, or you even try to incentivize them, but you're just trying to do something to get them to move. And the difference is that is short term. You walk out of the room, you're going to lose some people immediately.
Right.
But the fire within is helping them to take ownership of something where they see their part in it. And they see the value, what they bring to the table. And we have to, as leaders, remember to continually to sow this. I'm not talking about coming in with false, hey, you did a great job. No, it has to be very specific. You have to see the value of what they're doing because they might not readily see it. And can I tell you this? If you point out the value of their contribution, you really notice it and you point it out, you are going to get some longevity of a staff member because that creates loyalty. They're like, wow, they see me. So I'm going to stay here where I'm valued. So that's as far as the outward movement of that for us. Now, taking it upon us personally, the difference between being dedicated and being driven. I would have fallen in under the first category. I was definitely a driven personality. Now, if you're in ministry, this could be even more dangerous to you because what you're doing is holy. So, that just kind of brings some confusion to us if we aren't understanding that God, he doesn't want to use you. He wants you to be useful. And so therefore you have to take care of your soul. You have to take care of your temple. And you're not just going to drive yourself to the ground for the sake of anything or anyone, because that's not what God is asking of us. A dedication means I am not going to get off track of this. I'm not going to be easily discouraged. But we're not to be dedicated does not involve where you just run yourself to the point where your gift becomes your grind.
Wow. Wow. This is so good. And I feel like, I spent a good bit of my career being very, very, very driven. I even remember times when I would come in on a Saturday, right? And try to outwork everyone else, right? I think it was Will Smith that was quoted recently of saying, no one's going to outwork me. That mentality is not a dedicated mentality. It's a driven one. And eventually it'll drive you a little crazy until you decide to change.
And what's underneath that? I mean, I was guilty of that. I remember working a job and I would sneak into the office on Saturdays, and my husband didn't even know I was doing it because he was getting on me about the hours that I was putting in. So if he was gone on a Saturday, I went into the office. Now he could track me, from like 360. But fortunately, I've stopped that behavior. But here's the thing. What's underneath that is fear.
Yes.
And it's either fear or pride, or somehow those things are connected together.
Yeah.
And you are not working ultimately for a God who's going to drive you to the task, to the ground.
Wow. That's so good. And for me, I can pinpoint it exactly. It was really this phrase that I had in my head, which was, you have to work twice as hard as everyone else to get the same thing. And that is, talk about a defeatist mentality, right? You've already lost before you've even gotten on the starting line. And there's sometimes these tapes, right? These things that play in the background that we have to address, confront. And this idea of putting these two things next to each other, driven and dedicated, I think they help us look at that a little bit better.
In fact, everyone that's listening or watching the podcast, I want to suggest to you to take this assignment upon yourself, because we can talk about it, but for you to benefit of it, I want you to see how it's working in your life. And I want you to just draw a line, put driven and dedicated, draw the line down the middle and just start throwing some behaviors on either side to see where you land. A little self-test is good, right? To understand this, because we want to be dedicated. You overcome evil by doing good. So what does dedication really look like?
That's so good. That's so good. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about something else the two of you talked about in the article, and that was the 3 different types of relationships, or the 3 different levels. You talk about transaction, transformational, and this other level called transition. I would love to unpack that a little bit.
Yeah. And honestly, I see this as another layer, because not all transactional relationships are bad. We have expectations. We bring someone into our home to work on our, heat and air, right? That we're not expecting a long-term relationship. There's a specific goal, a specific task, and so forth. And transformational relationships, we almost would be prone to think that this is going to be a long relationship. That's maybe can set us up for a little disappointment, because some transformational relationships are transitional. They're for a season. I've had mentors in my life who came in and they were there. It wasn't transactional. We were accomplishing things. They were making change in my life, but it was for a season. And then the next season, there's somebody else that needs to come alongside, because, sometimes you're at this level and you're at this level. You need a different type of person helping to bring the next level of transformation. So I think what is good for us to do is to prayerfully discern what these relationships are. Because I will tell you, to this day, I have some relationships with people, and it is purely transactional. And I know it.
Yeah.
And they probably know it. But what's important is we know it, right? And
That's right.
so I set my expectations appropriately.
Yeah.
And these are still good, because, it's kind of like, I'll give you this and I'll give you this. And the understanding is there up front going forward. I'm not trying to make a transactional relationship into a transformational one, but the understanding too, that to get the most, why is it important to understand this particular layer of transitional? Because I think it helps us to get the most out of the moments.
This is so important. And I think if we can discover this in our own lives and kind of bucket maybe our top 10, 15 relationships and kind of figure out where they fall. So I hear it in my voice. We're giving them 2 assignments now, but this is good, right?
Here we go.
We want you to be introspective, but what if you were to start to bucket those and then try to put an understanding or a label next to each one of those? Because I feel that where we get hurt and disappointed is when there's that difference, right? You think it's a transformational, but they think it's transactional, and you're not on the same page. There's nothing, and what you're saying is so important. There's nothing wrong with transactional relationships if you both know it. But if each of you are putting a different weight on that relationship, that's where the heartache comes in. That's where there's a lack of clarity, when we haven't taken the time to really step back and ask, what bucket does this person fall in? And what is my intention as well? And sometimes I think, things happen informally as it moves from one level to another.
Exactly.
It can happen very informally.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that one of the things that's important to understand as far as transformational relationships are usually the iron sharpening the iron. There is a give and take.
Yeah.
Why do I say that? Because, it's one thing when you're in a transformational relationship with someone who is similar to you, right? And I'm not talking about hiring a coach and mentor. We understand the parameters of that relationship. But there are other relationships, people who are just down the road a little further than us, and they are more informal type of coaching relationships. And here's what I would say. Don't underestimate the value of what you have to bring to them. And I think it's important for us to open up the one-way streets to be, what can I do to serve you? What can I do to add value to you? Because there are a lot of people, if you look at the equation of their life, there are a lot more takers than they are givers.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying tit for tat, but what I'm saying is I think we have to look at, first of all, I don't care how much wealth and experience you're getting from that person, you have something to contribute to them as well. And you need to find out what it is. Why? Because that will help you, because you need to see how you add value to people who are further down the road, more accomplished than you are. You do need to see that, and do need to understand that. Even if it's just, hey, I'm going to commit to pray for you.
Mhm.
And I will tell you that some of my early mentors, I mean, I didn't know a thing. I was so green. And so I said to them, here's what I will do. I will commit to pray for you. And so I became an intercessor for them, and God would show me things, and I would send them a text or whatever. And sometimes it was like, oh my gosh, you have no idea. I was about to go into this meeting. So that makes me feel like, okay, I'm adding value to them.
Yeah.
That's a true transformational relationship. To me, the ultimate form of it is it's not just a one-way street.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I think that's so important. I have learned in the past that how important it is to set up the relationship from the beginning, especially when it's a mentorship relationship. A lot of times, uh, people don't know how to be mentored. And so they don't realize that someone's giving up their time, they're giving up their potential, and they're spending that, they're carving that out to be with you. So I think there's a ton of benefit from even going out and Googling, how to be a proper mentee, right? If you're receiving from someone, because there are things, it's not always going to be monetary, but what can you do to add value to their life so you're not just constantly taking? I love that point so much. I feel like we should do an episode on that sometime because I think
I like that.
that's a whole topic that we could dig into. I want to talk about you and John talk about this idea of the inner circle and how important that is. I would love to just learn a little bit more about what you talked about there and how important it is to prioritize things around this idea.
Well, and I think, first of all, what is the most crucial value that having an inner circle brings to me, in my opinion, is they have to help me where I have the blind spots. And John and I were talking about this. Some of this took place after the interview continued on.
It always does. It always like so good, right? You're like, we should have kept
We were talking
kept
about
going.
how and he's written a book about it, but he said, the self-aware leader, and he said, really, there's really no such thing as a self-aware leader. And what he meant by that is, and I agree with it 100%, is we have a limited amount of self-awareness.
Yeah.
Our curriculum only extends so far.
That's
And
right.
so the inner circle should be comprised of the kind of people who you've invited around you. Give them permission
Mm.
to tell you what you don't see. And I mean, and can I say this has to be a part of our prayer life? I mean,
Yeah.
here's what I do with the Lord as far as the end of the day, and I'm praying, I'm saying, Lord, what did I miss today? And at the beginning of the day, I'm asking him, what is it that I'm not seeing? Because he will reveal things by his spirit, but he also uses humanity around us.
Mhm.
And so if those people around us, as we're bouncing out, and we need to, here's the thing about accountability. It's not set in place unless you take advantage of it. Don't expect people to come knocking on your door because they had a vision in the night of you doing something. Doesn't happen that way. Okay. So it's the idea of these people who you bounce ideas, who you check things with, and ask them, as I'm sharing this with you, what am I missing?
Mm.
And letting them mostly reflect back to us if they observe something in our behavior or the way we talk to them, the relational dynamic.
Yeah.
So we can get the wisdom of ideas and kind of, how to take those forward. But if we get down to the real essence of the value they bring is these people have to be around you enough to observe you in the way you relate to others. Because that's the place where we truly miss it. We are not necessarily picking up on how we're showing up and landing with other people.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree. to read body language. And that does tell you something, but it's the people around us. So that should give us a cue as to who some of these people are, who is around you in the workplace, in the ministry place, who can reflect the things back to you. And do they really have permission to tell you the truth?
That's so good. I even think about just developmentally, there's low cost ways we can do this, and then there's high stakes ways we can do this. And I think low cost is just, I had somebody who she would get up and talk and she would say 50 times. And I said, "Hey, I think I can help you with that. And will you help me with this?" And I gave her something to help me with. And then we would come up to each other and be like, "You didn't do it this time. You didn't do it either." And like, it was great. And that was very low stakes. But then later that led to more high stakes conversations like what you're talking about with like, "Hey, I noticed in this deal that you were doing that, you didn't really know how to handle this moment. Let's unpack that for a second and talk about that together. I have some thoughts on how you could have handled it a little differently," which really gets into that relational piece. And it's a beautiful thing to have at the low stakes level, but it's an amazing thing to have at the high stakes level.
Yeah. And if you're a leader, you have to have the high stakes. You just do, because you can't afford not to be aware of your shortcomings. And these are also the same people that hold us accountable and help us to overcome those things.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. There's studies out there. I don't have the figures right in front of me. When we talk about how to achieve results, and most of the time, if we say, okay, we need these results, a lot of times we're conditioned to think the first thing we need to do is, okay, what incentivizes? And so we think of, financial, we think of all of these incentives put in front of people. But there's something that we are forgetting about that is a really, really good incentive. And do you know what that is? It's pain. In fact, I'll quote John. He said this statement. He said, "People will change when they hear enough, they want to, or hurt enough, they have to."
Yeah.
Pain is a great incentive for change. And so that's why we need the truth tellers around us to inflict a little bit of pain in our life, to incentivize us to change. It's not your run-of-the-mill form of incentivization, but it's good and it works. I mean, I know this to be true in my life. For example, I'm a bit of a procrastinator, which sometimes the end result of procrastinators is they're also late. They're late to show up to things. And my husband would, here we are going to the office and I'm running late because I'm trying to do too much or whatever. And he said to me, "Do you understand the message that sends? It's like, you are so important." And, I think about these divas out there doing their concerts and showing up. The stadiums are full and they show up an hour later because they didn't get their hair right. Like, how did you get to that level of thinking? Well, we can be practicing that behavior as well. And I think the pain of like, oh my gosh, what I am inflicting on others, that was the thing that helped lit the fire within and not underneath. Okay. So pain is a good incentivizer. So feel the pain and let it have its best work.
It's so good. Oh, I like that. Feel the pain and let it have its best work. What final thoughts would you have for our ladies today as they think about how to live an intentional life?
So I would start with this. You have to understand your value as a daughter. Now you might think, oh yes, I've heard this. Maybe you heard it, but are you practicing it? I don't know how we show up or how we sense when we show up in the presence of God, how we see ourselves. And the best way for us to see our value as a daughter is to allow him to truly be the kind of father he wants to be in our life.
Good.
And some of the issues, I had a father who was very abusive with his words. He wasn't, the most loving individual. He did the best he could, right? But I know that it altered my understanding of my Heavenly Father. And so if we talk about intentional living, I have to go back to the most important relationship that you and I have. And that's with our Heavenly Father. And I had to go through the exercise. I really feel like I'm saying this to help some people today who just aren't even considering this. Okay. You're never going to move past your need for a father, and you're never supposed to. So the idea of how do I allow him to be the father he wants to be? You sit down and you have quiet time with him and you say, Father, you are a good father. You've always been good to me. You start saying the things that he says about himself.
Yeah.
And you declare them as truths in your own life. Even though you might not be sensing those or feeling those, that is where you're exercising your faith of letting him be who he wants to be in your life. And you start declaring that over your life. And you say, I do receive your love as a daughter. I do believe you see me as a daughter whom you love and cherish. And you develop that conversation. And having that conversation is going to be pivotal to the essence of who you are. And from there, there's some very practical things we can talk about intentionally. Get John's book. But I want to go to the essence of this because as we get older, I'm 66. You might think, oh, I don't know. Do I need a father? I absolutely need a father more than I ever did in my life.
Wow.
You're not going to outgrow it.
Mhm.
But I want you to learn how to truly have it with the best father, the greatest father there is, your Heavenly Father, who loves you and cherishes you.
I love that. That's a beautiful final thought. Thank you for that. Well, thank you for your time today. This has been so awesome. And I'm just excited for the women to dig into this particular article. And I believe that they're just going to glean so much gold from this topic with you and John. Thank you so much for your time.
Awesome. God bless you.
Well, thank you for joining the Thrive Today podcast. Be sure to follow, share, subscribe on all of your social media platforms, and tell other women about this leadership podcast. To follow Colleen, you can head over to LinkedIn at Colleen Rouse. She is CW Rouse on IG. And of course, follow us at Thrive Today Women as well. Now, let me ask you a question. If you haven't taken the time to get into community, what are you waiting for? Head over to thrivetoday.com today and connect with us through membership. You'll get monthly coaching calls. You get a quarterly box that is curated beautifully every time just for you, and so much more. So we want to see you over at Thrive Today. Have a great day, and don't forget to thrive. We'll see you next time.